I'll give you a moment to connect to sound. Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1302nd New Social Environment. I'm Chloe Stagaman, Director of Programs here at the Rail, and I have the extreme pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Beverly Adams, Christophe Cherix, and Amanda Gluibizzi on the occasion of the exhibition Wifredo Lam, When I Don't Sleep, I Dream at MoMA. And now I'll introduce today's guests and host. Beverly Adams is the Estrellita Brodsky Curator of Latin American Art at the Museum of Modern Art. In addition to the recent co-curation of Wifredo Lam, When I Don't Sleep, I Dream, she has organized numerous collection exhibitions there. Prior to joining MoMA in 2019, Adams served as curator of Latin American art at the Blanton Museum at the University of Texas at Austin, where she holds a PhD in art history from. Christophe Cherix assumed the role of the David Rockefeller Director of the Museum of Modern Art in September of 2025. Cherix joined the museum's curatorial staff in 2007 after serving as curator of the Cabinet des Estampes at the Musée d'Art et d'Histoire in Geneva, Switzerland. His expertise lies in modern and contemporary art, with a particular focus on the art of the 1960s and 1970s. Born in Switzerland, Cherix holds a licence et lettres from the University of Geneva. And our host today, Amanda Gluibizzi, is the founding co-director of the new Foundation for Art History and ArtSeen editor for the Brooklyn Rail. She specializes in mid and late 20th century art, design, and urbanism in the United States, Europe, and Latin America. Amanda is the author of Art and Design in 1960s New York from Anthem Press. And with that, I will pass it over to Amanda to get us started.
Great. Thank you so much, Chloe. I appreciate your Belgian upbringing for all of those French pronunciations. So thank you so much for that. Happy New Year, everybody. It's so nice to see all of you in 2026. And thank you to Beverly and Christophe for being here today to discuss this remarkable exhibition. I think that I'm probably not alone in already having loved Lam's The Jungle, which of course is owned by MoMA and often on display, at least if you're my age. But this is a wonderful, wonderful opportunity to get to know this artist better. And so I'm so excited to speak with the curators about this. I just want to say beforehand, too, that MoMA was very kind to let me read a PDF of the catalog. And I have to say, it's been a very long time since I've read an exhibition catalog that was simultaneously both so insightful and so beautifully written. So if you've loved the show, I strongly urge you to get the catalog too. It's been such a pleasure to read it. So Christophe, Beverly, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. So we're going to do things a little bit differently today. Chloe's going to run through some install shots while I ask the first question. And then Beverly and Christophe had this amazing idea that we should actually just focus on a few works of art today. And they can do kind of a deep dive or a close reading of those works with us. And I think this is a fabulous idea. I'm a huge, huge advocate for close reading. So as we get started, can you both start by giving us a bit of a background on Lam in case people aren't familiar with the artist, as well as a background on this exhibition, why now, and MoMA's relationship with Wifredo Lam?
Christophe, do you want to start?
No, please go ahead.
Okay. Well, just the brief biographical sketch. Wifredo Lam was born in Cuba in 1902, went to study and work in Spain in the early 1920s, was also in Paris and Marseille, returned to Cuba because of World War II in the early 1940s. He had this remarkable life marked by exile and displacement and reconnection with the Caribbean, and he really is a remarkable painter and an artist that I spent a lot of time studying as a Latin Americanist. But what was interesting to me working with Christophe on the show is that we both, I think, came from very different perspectives. And maybe, Christophe, you can talk about Lam and his connection to MoMA, which I think was also an important driver for us to not just what an exceptional artist he is, but also to revisit his connection with the museum in this exhibition.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Chloe. Thank you, Amanda, for having us. It's really a pleasure to spend some time together around that exhibition. And as you said, Amanda, often Wifredo Lam is known through the lens of one painting, an extraordinary painting, which is in fact not really a painting, it's a drawing on paper, The Jungle, which came to the collection very early on in 1945. And I think part of the incentive of the exhibition, when Beverly and I joined force a few years ago, was trying to show that Lam was not the painter of a single work. How beautiful, how extraordinary that work was. That there was very much a before, going back, as Beverly said, to the early 20s, and going much further out after The Jungle. So it was to really think about Lam and his practice, more just than the maker of an extraordinary work of art. And in a nutshell, its relation to MoMA run deep. We acquired The Jungle in 1945, where it was shown at Pierre Matisse Gallery in New York. But it's not the first work we acquired. Our founder, Alfred Barr, in 1939, so very early in the history of the Museum of Modern Art, MoMA was only 10 years old, walked into a gallery in Paris, the Galerie Pierre, and saw Lam's first exhibition in Paris and acquire a beautiful drawing, Mother and Child. And a couple of years, that became the first work by Lam to enter any collection in the world, very much as contemporary art. And a few years later, in 1942, he went to visit Lam in Havana and acquired a second work, the beautiful Satan, which is also in the exhibition. So The Jungle is a third work that we acquired by Lam, and we felt with Beverly that we needed to go back to that moment and just to pay attention to the full scope of the work at that moment.
Thank you both so much for that. I have been lucky enough to travel to Cuba and was stunned by the holdings of Lam's work in the National Museum in Havana, because indeed the one work that I knew from Lam was The Jungle. And so it was such an exciting thing for me to be able to get to know him better. And now we have this opportunity to just travel down the street, if you will, to see more. One thing that the catalog talks about a little bit is just the difficulty that the museum had in the past of placing Lam as an artist. And I assume this is partly because of his heritage, a surrealist of Caribbean heritage and of African and Chinese descent, but also because he was very known for working on works on paper. And so, as Christophe mentioned, The Jungle is a work on paper, not necessarily a painting. And so I was just kind of curious about that too, how the museum has thought about Lam in the past and how you're trying to work with his of now.
I think what is remarkable about Lam is that we're only finally catching up with ways to think about his work, that he was so far ahead of us as an artist who's truly transnational, and who is not easy to categorize. And that's on purpose, is because he's so devoted to invention and to creating his own way. An artist who picked up tools and learned things along the way and deployed those tools, like surrealism, like many things, for his own purposes. So he just never really fit tidily into categories. And, not for lack of trying. If you'll read many catalogs that talk about him as like a student of Picasso, which is untrue, or as just a surrealist, or as a Cuban artist, put him into the national frame, or as a Latin American artist, which is so nebulous and doesn't really, help with the categorization. So they're either too tight or too wide, these categories. So when Christophe and I were looking at everything, we just wanted to make sure that we were paying attention to what the artist was saying about his own work, and that we represented and opened it up so that the categories didn't matter, so that people could just come and see and look and consider Lam's voice and his approach, as Christophe was saying, his way of working, his practice. So if before we tried to shoehorn him in someplace, this exercise was a way to sort of release him from those categories that just didn't work, that were outdated and not important for his way of working.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is interesting to think about him as being an artist who is between so many things. And of course, thinking then about reconceptualizing that as perhaps among so many opportunities. And so then preventing him from being a truly insular artist, instead, not just being amongst his peers, but also representing him as the global artist that he was.
Yeah, very much. I think the fact that the in-betweenness, the hybridity of his practice, both in terms of medium, you never know if it's really a painting or a drawing. It behaves like a painting, but it's made like a drawing, or it behaves like a drawing, but it's painted on paper. But also the hybridity of his motifs. You never know if what you are looking like is human or animal or vegetal. That capacity to never really, as Beverly said, fit in nicely into one category. What was certainly one of the reasons why it took so long to fully recognize him, today is really one of his strengths. That's really his singularity, not to really fit anywhere nicely. And even the fact that he lived in many places of the world, this kind of fact that he was really one of the first true transnational artists, is something that is today recognized and today has an extraordinary legacy.
Yes, he was prescient in so many ways. And what Christophe and Beverly have just been saying are definitely some of them. So let's move to some of the works that we wanted to look at. Chloe, the first one is the Spanish Civil War from 1937, and that is slide 13. This has quite a bit of similarity with some of his works. Again, it is a work on paper that's then been mounted on canvas, so it can be displayed as kind of like a painting, though it's on paper. And it also has this format that he shows again and again and again, a near square format. And we see that with The Jungle and also with works like Astral Harp, for example. They're not square perfectly, but they're near square. However, there are important differences here too. For example, when he's depicting the scrum of this battle, he seems to be bearing in mind the edges of the paper, which is really further defined by its laying down on canvas. It almost seems as though it's nearly a deductive composition, where he's taking the edges of his ground and pushing things in and really, really trying to compress things. So I was curious about that first. Can you tell us a little bit about the paper that he's working with and this goal to suggest this really, really dense battle that he's depicting?
I can start maybe, and then Christophe, you can say more, but this was 1937 and it was the middle of the war, which he participated in. He was fighting and using his what he had to offer to fight against fascism during the Spanish Civil War. This picture was a commission, not in the monetary sense, but it was asked that he paint a picture of the Spanish Civil War to be included in the Spanish pavilion in France, the same pavilion where Picasso's Guernica was shown. Yet this is made from what he could find to make a work of art. It's brown wrapping paper, craft paper. It's just a wood pulp paper. And these are homemade gouaches. You can tell it's a very limited selection of colors because maybe he didn't have that many options. He did not finish the work in time, so it was not included in that exhibition. And so what's interesting here too, besides what you pointed out about the border, which I think is something you will see when you look at his drawing practice or you look at his works in the 30s, even into Paris, he's very mindful of the borders when he works on paper, and he leaves, except for the jungle where they've been trimmed, but he leaves a little extra. He frames it in the paper. But there's a degree of finish and unfinish here in this work, where the paper takes an active role as a color, as part of the composition. He's also looking at older works of art, probably in the Prado, which depict battle scenes. So there's classical references as well as his own take on the horrible situation and things that he would have witnessed around him at the time. Christophe, would you like to add to this maybe?
Maybe just to pick on the point that, asking ourselves if that work is fully finished. And that's a fair question. It was made such in difficult, turbulent times, and it was only exhibited much later. But what we know is that kind of unfinished quality sees so much of the paper coming through the composition, but also the fact that he used a very humble material, craft paper. Both of those things are due only by necessity, because of the time, and maybe him not having the time to complete further that work or to use stronger material in order to make it. But strangely, that became really a defining point of his work. That unfinished quality, the idea that the work, lets the paper breathe or the canvas appear throughout the composition. And the fact that he's going to love using paper like one used canvas or using canvas like one used paper. So it really confused the roles of those material, something that's going to define him. So it was very important for us to have that work. It's the first time it's ever shown in the United States. And it also showed that if Lam had a civic political mind, it just doesn't only appear with a jungle. It's already there, a work that directly connects with the tragedy that unfolding around him.
I was very interested about whether it was unfinished or not, and I'm glad that you both kind of talked about that a little bit. I really appreciate the state of non-finito versus finito here, not least because the paper is allowed to then be contour line. It's such an interesting way of thinking about the ground pushing forward in the composition. Prior to going live, we were also talking about printmaking. And there too, I think that there's a really interesting way of thinking about how line can either move forward or recede. And here Lam is doing this in a single composition. When he does use the black contour lines too, it permits our eyes to focus on that kind of lower right hand, I don't know what I would call it, quadrilateral of figures without also pushing them forward. So the composition is permitted to remain quite flat and compressed, even though he's drawing our eyes to certain elements in the work.
It's a very good point, and I think a very nice perspective to add here, comparing that work, which has a huge scale, to small engraving. And if you look at battle scene early in the Renaissance, you'll see also that sometimes that impulse to fill the compositions, kind of horror vacui, like every little part is used, even if the paper comes through, is going to fit as many figures as he can, just to really give the sense of that struggle. And that really goes back to earlier engraving that he must have seen at the Prado or elsewhere.
Christophe is talking about things perhaps like Paleowalo's Battle of the Nude Men, or Michelangelo's Battle of Cascina. The Cascina image, especially to me, was striking because of the single figure that's facing us fully frontally.
Yeah.
That is, in the catalog, it suggested that it could possibly be a self-portrait, or looks kind of like self-portraits that he had drawn. But also there is a figure fully en face in the Michelangelo Cascina. And so here too, there's this really, really wonderful way that this composition is referencing well-known and art historical versions of battle.
Yeah, and one of the references that you find in the literature, early literature on Lam, is Paolo Uccello. Again, like going back to 15th century Italian Renaissance.
And just to underscore, he was classically trained. He went to the academy in Madrid. He knew all of these things. He was looking at everything. But this work is really this. We started with this like late 30s, 37 moment, because this is the moment where, his commitment to the modern and to, the political really coalesces. And this is, his jump from all of that academic training, even though we see it still there, and it follows him through his career, throughout his career. This is really the point of departure in a lot of ways.
Before we move on, I just want to check if there is anything else you want to tell us about this extraordinary image. Okay, we'll move on. All right, so Chloe, let's move to the next. Christophe, you asked us to include at least one or two self-portraits of Lam, and so we've already seen a potential self-portrait in the Civil War painting or work, but now we're seeing a self-portrait. Can you tell us a little bit about this?
Yeah, so this one is clearly a self-portrait. I mean, we can even recognize him if you look at pictures of Lam at that moment. It was intended as a self-portrait. It's not always the case with Lam. Sometimes there is still question marks around that. But in that case, I always found that work so moving, because you see him as a young man arriving from Cuba and very much inhabiting a space, trying to position himself, being like, asking for being part of something that fascinates this kind of modern art that really is embedded in both in Madrid and Barcelona at that moment. And crossing his arm, almost waiting for something to happen. And the background is also so beautiful because it directly here relates to Spain, but also it makes you think very strongly about Matisse. Often Lam is often related to Picasso, but one of the really influences on Lam early on must have been Matisse. This capacity he has to this ability of lines, the capacity, the fluidity that he has to think about a composition almost like improvised directly here on the paper, very lightly done, I think really come through a work like that.
And I wanted to point out, because of Amanda's earlier comment, for her to look at the margins here. You see he's used a black outline to delineate the space or to frame this drawing. And then even inside of that frame, he just comes right up close to it, but doesn't meet it all the way. So it's almost a device that you'll see recur a lot. And this is just such a beautiful self-portrait. He stops doing direct self-portraits at this time too. This is really the last major self-portrait that we see of the artist. In the 30s and the 20s, we see several. And then when he goes to Paris and as he moves on, we don't see them pictured that way, very directly. Like Christophe said, waiting for something to happen or defiantly. It's really a gorgeous thing.
I was really struck when I saw this painting of the zigzagging, almost decorative quality of that right hand folded under his other arm. Kind of a wonderful way of placing him in the space, but also letting him stand apart from the space.
Mhm.
I was also really struck by the fact, of course, that he is at least half nude, right? This is something that we don't always see with self-portraits, especially, before, let's say, our time. And I was trying to think of other artists who made nude self-portraits, and the person I could think of was Dürer.
Yeah, it's definitely something that he might have encounter, through examples from the past. But I think here there's also something here to mark his own identity, to say who he is as a body, just coming, from a foreign land, and just again looking for a way to develop its own style. I really always think about that work as an artist just on the point of emergence, he has integrated, so many extraordinary ideas, tools, styles around him. But he is just waiting to make his mark. And there is something that always fascinates me in Lam throughout his work, but really starting already at that time, is that how ambitious he can be, but in a best positive sense. He wants to be an artist who's going to have a radical presence within his generation, and he does that without any public at that moment, without any capacity to sell his work, but it's already there.
Late in the catalog, someone mentions Glissant's idea of opacity, and the potential for opacity as a strategy. And I think that this is a really interesting painting to think about in those terms, because we see the artist naked, but also very self-possessed. For example, his arms crossed. He doesn't make eye contact with us. He's incredibly forthright, but also, I don't know, within himself as well. And so I was curious about how we can think about that idea, that concept of opacity with something as naked as this.
I think it's an interesting observation. This is done right at his point of departure, like right before he leaves for Paris too. So I do think that he is about to embark on something completely, on something that may be completely different. But at this moment, he's trying very hard, as Christophe says, to merge his political ideals and his interest in modernism and his ambitions, and his belief in art as a potential for change. All of those things are swirling around, but there isn't. It takes a few more steps for him to really arrive.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think we can think about it in that way too. There's this opacity because there's so much happening still for him. It's not clear yet about where he will land. And there's been so much uncertainty in his life up to this point. His time in Spain was not just school. He lost a wife and child to tuberculosis. He's fighting in the war. He's been unable to paint or get materials. I mean, it's been in this struggle, this combat, for just to be an artist.
And what he puts forward here is also this strong contrast. He has no clothes, but the environment behind him has this kind of decorative pattern throughout. So he comes here, as you say, half naked in a space that also feels very religious. And suddenly that opposition between himself as a young artist that's going to develop his own style and his own practice, and the world around him, I think is just beautifully expressed.
Mm. Those are such nice ways of thinking about that. Thank you. The next images we have show him embarking on a collaboration with André Breton and here Jacqueline Lamba. So he moves to Paris, he's in France, and World War II breaks out, and he finds that he needs to flee. And so eventually he finds himself on a boat back to Cuba, and he's with people that prove to be incredibly important to him. And so could you tell us a little bit about both his return to Cuba, but also his collaborations with Breton?
So he's asked to leave Paris. He's half Black and he's half Chinese and he's from Cuba. He's like three strikes when it comes to the Nazis. And so, like so many others, he flees to Marseille in southern France in hopes of safe passage to the New World. And like so many others, he's there for a long time, uncertain. Not quite a year, but 8 months, waiting, going through visa processes, working like everyone, preoccupied to find a safe haven and an escape from the country. Breton is there. He had met Breton earlier in Paris, and every Sunday, all of the artists and intellectuals who were in the same situation would meet at the Villa Herbel in Marseille and play these games and do these collective collaborative works. And this is a collective work. We know who three of the artists who were part of it are, because Breton later wrote on the backs, but there are others probably that were also there. Oscar Dominguez was there, Wolfgang Paulin, all of these artists were in and out of this space at the time. And these works, these cadaverous ski, these collective anonymous yet not anonymous works were a remarkable transformation for Lam. He really, the surrealism and these surrealist exercises really unleash an important opening up of his imaginary and of his psyche and of his drawing style, of everything. But at the same time, they are, as he called them, a combat of creation, like to do collective work, to play in the face of, this political situation is in fact to push against it, to propose something else. So this moment in Marseille is truly remarkable. This is a beautiful drawing from the Pompidou, and Lam's intervention is the bottom part of this drawing. You see this beautiful ship where one of his works is like functions as a mast or a sail, and he's written a poem on a postcard at the very bottom. These collaborations with other artists, but also especially with poets, would be central to his practice from this point forward. And so we have a lot of works in this section of Marseille because it really is a transformative moment for him. We could look at the next slide. Maybe, Christophe, you could talk more about Fata Morgana, which is really important.
Absolutely. And just to add, when he's in Marseille, this young man is confronted to his third exile. The first time was a voluntary one. He left Cuba to learn and to go to Spain and to get an education. But when he's in Spain, it's not, he has to leave Spain because of Franco. And he actively takes part, in the Civil War. And he finds himself in Paris, and here again, he has to flee. So just to understand the multiplicity of trauma and tragedy that just inhabits the early part of his work. And those drawings that seems very playful, colorful, children-like almost, they're full of that anxiety. That's a way to fight again the terror that's around them. And I think sometimes we forget that dimension, that it's such a, as Beverly says, such a moving way to think about a group of international artists. To oppose what's happening around them is to produce something that's purely collective. And now we know some of the names of the artists because Breton told us some of them, but we don't know all of them. And the point then was never to sign them. It was profoundly, essentially a collective production. And that I think is just very, very important for that moment. And when he's in Marseille, they're going to be trapped there multiple months, waiting for the boat to take them away. And it's then that André Breton asked him to illustrate one of his poems, Fata Morgana. And Lam is going to make this beautiful line drawing that's going to be a real departure in his work, kind of illustrating, relating to Breton's text, but very loosely. It's almost like two creators working side by side. And Fata Morgana is very little known as a publication because it was censored by Vichy. Then of course they never got the authorization to publish it. So the only way to bypass that was to produce just a few, I think it's 5 or 6, I don't remember now, but each would be hand colored. So if you zoom in, if you look closely, all have those beautiful little touch of watercolor that make them each very unique and almost like sky composition, so something that becomes very magical. So we're very fortunate to have two of those there. And it's just after completing that finally that boat does pick them up, and where Lam will find very much again his own desire again in Cuba.
Yes, there's a quote in the catalog where he seems quite ambivalent about it, that he's had so much anguish, but there's also anguish in leaving Europe.
It's been 20 years in Europe, or some 20 years. So he knows maybe more Europe at that point than his natal land. And when all his friends, those great writers and poets, they all go to Mexico and New York. And because of the fact that his father was Chinese and the US had very strong immigration law quotas in relation to Chinese immigrants, he's not accepted. And for him, it's a real disappointment. That's not the place where he doesn't want to go back home. Again, he's a very ambitious artist. He wants to be with his peers, but strangely, that's where he's going to reinvent his work.
That's such a wonderful segue to the jungle, which is our next slide. Christophe has already talked a little bit about color. And so, of course, I think we would have to talk about color here. And I do have a question prepped just in case. But I also want to point out that in the catalog essay about this, Beverly, you mentioned too that the figures we're seeing here are clearly working with the similar logic of the exquisite corpse drawings that Lam had been working on with his collaborators and friends. So can you lead us into the jungle a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, the ship goes to Martinique where they're arrested, then they go to the Dominican Republic, and then he ends up in Cuba. It's a long ride home. It's a year almost in transit between the time he leaves Paris to when he arrives in Cuba. And when he's first able to set up shop and have a studio and a place to work, he makes these remarkable gouaches, over 100 of them that are smaller scale. Christophe mentioned Satan, which is in our collection from 1942. So he does an extraordinary collection of these drawings, which are kind of an elaboration, the same logic of these exquisite corpses that he was working on, where you have these bodies, which are composites, which are connected to their surroundings in certain ways, or they have both male and female attributes, or they have animal and human attributes. They're interconnected and not the same logic that we would think of a regular figure. Those are shown in Pierre Matisse Gallery, those 1942 gouaches. They're shown in Pierre Matisse Gallery in 1942. Lam sends a batch of them for Pierre Matisse to select, and he also asked Breton if he will name them. So those collaborations continue. The jungle is kind of a jump from that, and in fact, it's a look back. And if in the installation you can actually look at the jungle and then directly turn behind you and see the Spanish Civil War, because there is this shape connection that you mentioned earlier, this almost square. There's also a material connection in that they're both large pieces of craft paper that have been glued together. In this case, though, he's used very dilute oil. And so, which is why the color is so extravagant and so bright and has lasted so many years of being exhibited. And we don't just have the figure, these composite figures, but we have them set in a landscape, which is a big deal. We have that horror vacui that Christophe mentioned with Guerra Civil, but we have instead of it being bodies in motion and arms and guns and things like that, we have a landscape. And that landscape is a very particular landscape, which is the landscape of the Caribbean and the history of the Caribbean plantation and slavery, and it is sugarcane. So we have these long poles of sugarcane stalks mixed with leaves that could or could not be maybe tobacco, and then the arms and legs of the figures intertwine and intermix with these large poles of sugarcane, and we have this dense rhythmic composition that's all over and has very, very shallow space. All of the figures are sort of balanced at the very front edge of the picture. This is, again, like Civil War, a very innovative work for him, innovative work for him in terms of his style, but also a very political and engaged statement in the same way. So it's this moment of innovation and belief that kind of combine in this picture.
Christophe, do you want to add anything?
I mean, there is so much we could add. Maybe just one thing that relate also to the to our goals in making that exhibition. It was, as I mentioned, to know the before and after the jungle, but also to better understand the jungle itself. Painting has been in our collection for a very long time, but now we have a way to analyze it, and we worked very closely with our conservation colleagues, conservators both on paper and painting conservators, try to understand how it was made, how those sheets of paper were put together, what did he start with, what medium did he use. For many years, we used to label that work as a gouache on paper because we could not really imagine that a work of that scale would be done on oil on paper. And Lam had told us so, but we might not have believed him fully. And now we're able to prove it and just to really, and we looked at a number of letters by Lam when he talked about that work, when he made it, particularly in his relationship to Pierre Matisse, and he really said that he couldn't find canvas and he wanted to make a painting and he wanted to look like a painting. So if the Spanish Civil War seems unfinished, a lot of the paper come through, here you hardly see anything because he said he wanted to hide all the paper. He wanted people to really think about that to be really a major statement. That changed over time. We learned, for instance, that the entire background was most likely pink at one point of its making. And it's his dealer from Paris, Pierre Loeb, when he see that work in Havana, say, hey, not sure about the pink. Maybe you want to rethink. And Lam goes back to it and you'll see it everywhere, but how that work changed, evolved, and was really the culmination of a process, very much made directly on the spot, on the paper itself.
I was stunned when I read the conservation essay in the catalog about the pink. And there's an image, actually, a close-up of like a line where the pink is still able to be seen because of a crack. And it was interesting as a thought experiment to consider, would this work be as successful as it is if it were pink?
It's a fair question. I don't have an answer for maybe Beverly has a thought.
I don't know. There's it would be harder to read as the jungle, right? Because we think about the jungle in green and those colors, but I think it probably would have read much more metaphorically and less literally. And that's one of the questions about this painting too. It's like people have always taken it so literally, like, is it a jungle? Is there a jungle or not in Cuba? Instead, when it's a larger meditation on the Caribbean and on that place, on, all of the mask-like faces, which are connected to, obviously, definitely the African art that he saw in Europe, but also trying to reconnect them to a history and a context in Cuba. So the pink would have made this even more metaphorical and less literal, but I do think you still see this proliferation of amazing colors in this space, that maybe it wouldn't have been too crazy. Maybe it would have been okay. I don't know.
Maybe it would have been called the sunset or something.
Exactly.
Yeah, but that's a good point to call it the sunset. One of the great scholars on Lam who did so much and great curator on Lam, Catherine David, pointed that if you really look at this painting, and here it's really close looking, it's hard to do on a screen, but please come to the museum and it's more visible then. The painting is divided in almost two equal parts. On the left, we could call it a darker, a night part, and on the right, a brighter, a light part, almost from night and day. When you see something happening, if you just look at the painting from left to right and right to left, it's a moment of transformation. And I think that it's one of the things that make that work so magical, that every time you look at it, every time you're going to be absorbed by something else. It's almost like a game of hide and seek with the work. So I think it's a painting that can open so many interpretations.
And I think, Christophe, just to underline a word that you used, which I think is central to Lam's work after he returns to Cuba, is that word transformation and the possibility of transformation. I think that's something that idea is very present in how he paints, but also he's thinking about that in a larger way.
I was really struck learning that it had been pink originally, because of course I so deeply affiliate it with this wonderful blue-green and the dappled quality of the surface, and how much that's informed my feelings about global surrealism. Whether I think about, like, for example, Roberto Matta, or if I zoom forward into the contemporary day and include someone like Salman Tour and their paintings, it's kind of a remarkable thing that it was this close to not being the painting the work that we love and know so well.
And one way to think about it is to think that the pink is most probably carried over from Spain and Paris. And when he kind of moved to those beautiful greens and blues, those beautiful shades of color, he absolutely embraced the environment of Cuba. And in that green and those blues, in fact, are going to disappear again when he leaves Cuba, in the very late 40s, early 60s. You'll see him changing his palette, moving the vegetation away, and those green and blue will always never return. So another way to think about it would be to say that suddenly that painting really took place in Cuba itself because of the tropicality that it emanates.
That's such a nice way of thinking then about the next image in our slideshow, which is Astral Harp. And here too, kind of picking up on that tonality of paint or works. I keep saying paintings, works like the jungle. But here, whereas the jungle felt almost suffocating, it really does suggest that heat and potential humidity. Now we have something that is much more available to us. It's aerated in a certain way. And we have basically a whole room of works that are similar to this, including, Christophe, you mentioned especially the work that's owned by RISD, where Lam is really working again with figure ground and then using that white or paleness of the ground to let it push forward and actually become the figure in a very, very interesting way that I guess we could kind of see being foreshadowed in things like the Spanish Civil War.
No, absolutely. And maybe Beverly can, talk a little bit more about those two paintings, but just to introduce it, one thing that struck us is like it really exemplifies Lam's interest for opposition, for dichotomies, the idea for negative space, negative and positive space. And here you see an extraordinary painting that was almost a pendant to another great work, which is today in RISD, that I'm sure we'll see in a few in a few moments. Thinking about those two works side by side, almost in a dialogue. And maybe Beverly, do you want maybe just to set the stage in Haiti?
Well, I mean, these two works, the one that you mentioned, Eternal Presence and Harp Astral, were both exhibited in Haiti in 1945. And the interesting thing is with this Harp Astral, it's made out of 3 pieces of canvas. So like if we think about him piecing together pieces of paper, he also pieced together canvas when he could finally afford it, when he was showing and getting a stipend from Pierre Matisse and had money for materials finally. He still is constructing the size that he wants, the scale that he wants by whatever materials that he has, and is able to do that. And you're right that there is this figure ground relationship that's going on here. Also, he's directly referencing a lot of the imagery is starting to reflect his setting, and he's looking and thinking about Afro-Cuban religion. He's thinking about transformation and practice. He's thinking about these diasporic traditions that he's encountering and how not to represent them in any kind of iconographical way, but in terms of feeling, in terms of color, in terms of that ethereality that you talked about, this openness, this invisibility and visibility, these things that are on the threshold between seeing and not seeing, between foreground and background. He's really playing with all of these things in both in a formal way and sort of metaphorical, thinking about larger questions. So, he really is so happy to finally be able to work again and to really, really challenge himself and take on these questions that he's interested in, and really paint again after such a long return.
I mean, less than 2 years, he moves from, just to use again the word opacity, that would be a nice way to qualify the jungle. You can't get through the jungle. It's the only fragments coming at you, and here it goes from opacity to absolute transparency, and you almost see through that work. He goes from auto painting from painting to watercolor. So and those shifts happen so quickly within his work that makes his practice so interesting at that time.
Christophe, you have described Astral Harp and the Eternal Present almost as like pendant paintings.
Yes.
One of the interesting things about the Eternal Present is its makeup. I'm not sure if everybody can read this, but it is oil and pastel over paper mache and chalk ground on bast fiber fabric. I did a quick search in my PDF of the catalog. This is the only thing on paper mache. And so I was just curious, a quick question. Is this a unicum in his practice?
So yes and no. Maybe Beverly can talk a little bit about the technical aspect of it. But so that work has been described as such. We spend quite a long time looking at this work, with our conservators, and believe that the way it was made is in fact much more traditional and aligned with Lam's practice. Beverly, do you want maybe to add a few words?
Yeah, we weren't able to look at it, underneath the glazing, but what is interesting is that if you look at the surface, it is textured, and it was probably like a a more coarse burlap fabric rather than the finer linen canvas that he, had painted using harpistral. So we think, or the conservators think, that he was trying to make his own kind of gesso or ground to first layer that and minimize the texture of the burlap to make it smoother and look finer, and that's that all over background color that you see where the figures pop out of the ground. So we think it's like an attempt for him to somehow smooth out or make more even the surface. So not necessarily paper mache, but some sort of like homemade, we're not sure what it consists of, gesso-like substance.
Fascinating. Everybody commit this composition to memory as we move to then our next slide. This is large composition. Obviously, they are not exactly the same, but there is a very strong compositional similarity between the previous slide and this large composition, especially if we look at these hybrid metamorphizing horse figures on left and right. This is one of the centerpieces of the exhibition, an enormous work on paper, and also a very recent acquisition by MoMA. So please tell us more about this work.
So that's Lam's largest work, at least largest movable work. After that, he made 3 murals that, of course, cannot be transported. And it's a work that we believe is an absolute threshold within his practice. It's really the moment where he's thinking about going back to Europe, leaving Cuba. The war has ended. Time is still not right for him to move back. Europe is in ruins. So he's going back and forth, but you see his works changing, evolving. And you are right. So Rizzi painting is somewhere in the background of that work because it's a moment that is going to let the material express itself more directly. But here he shifts to paper again. And that's fascinating for us because it's at a moment that he shows his work internationally. He can afford canvas. So that becomes really a choice. And he goes back not to a fine paper, he goes back to the very same paper that he used in Spain and in Cuba when he had no other way to paint, this craft paper. And you see here the craft paper coming throughout the work at a scale that never happened and never will happen again. Another element that makes this work so interesting to us, as I mentioned earlier, is a palette. Suddenly it's not just brown. If you look at it, you'll see beautiful purple, beautiful light blues, very subtle pattern. But you don't have those green, you don't have this kind of very colorful, vibrant environment of the other works. And the last thing that makes it so singular is like he's focusing on the figure. The environment goes away. And those figures start to connect with each other. It becomes this incredible parade at a scale when you are in the show that you seem to, it's almost immersive. You're almost part of that parade. It includes you. You immerse into the work itself. So Beverly and I, really, when we started the exhibition, our goal was to really be able to bring it into the exhibition, as we felt that was such a marker, such a moment that showed that really there is an extraordinary after jungle.
Christophe is right. This work is so large that depending on how tall you are, the figures could be close to your life size. And so they are an environment, not just a work on paper. I was particularly struck by this right-hand figure, clearly meant to be somewhat of a female figure, given that it has breasts. And the way that its head and neck kind of extend into this enormous mask-like apparatus. I know that Lam consciously referenced African masks in others of his works, including in The Jungle. But here I'm wondering too, is he still looking at those precedents?
Sure, but he's trying to create like a context for them. He's building a world for those references and those masks, and it includes things from Africa and things from from the Caribbean, and it includes this psychic space that only he can imagine. That's all interconnected, where the ground is also the figure, and the figure morphs into three other figures. I think he's starting to build this very conscious new universe for all of these references, and it's a way to sort of counteract what we might think of appropriation, or sort of the minimizing of these references to their formal attributes, but he's really trying to build a world for them where they all make sense and interconnect.
That's such a wonderful way of thinking about it. I was struck by this quote that's mentioned in the catalog. In The Jungle and in other works, I have tried to relocate Black cultural objects in terms of their own landscape and in relation to their own world. My painting is an act of decolonization, not in a physical sense, but in a mental one.
There you go. He says it all right there.
Yes, and in 1980, again, really suggesting the prescience and just the intuitiveness and understanding of this artist.
Well, he was always these were topics that were always important to him. When he meets Aimé Césaire, the poet and statesman Aimé Césaire in Martinique on his way back in 1940, I mean, Aimé Césaire's return to native land, he gives Lam a copy, and he inscribes it saying, to our struggles and our dreams and our beliefs, like he was already very much, interested in thinking about how to reconsider, the colonial condition and the diaspora. And he was very much connected to these poets and revolutionaries and thinkers who were thinking through these materials. Césaire and he had a lifelong friendship, and they collaborated. He also illustrated works for Edouard Glissant in the 50s. I mean, and in the 60s when he returns to Europe, he's very much interested in these, colonial struggles, post-colonial struggles in Africa, like people trying to, like he has to leave France during the Algerian War because people think he's Algerian. Like these struggles for independence that are happening in the world around him are really meaningful. And then of course there's Cuba. So these are things that are part of his world and his concern.
And one of the threads that throughout his career is that his work aimed at empowering people. And that's just very rare to see that consistently through decades of work. Even if you think about the way women are depicted, female figure, they kind of ridden by spirits, a powerful goddess or creature that just really hold the ground. And that's when he developed all those works called Femme Cheval, Woman Horse. The same, they sit in throne. They're not victims. They really something that they creature that's going to change the world, to have an impact on the world around them. And that's, I think, what makes the Lam's work so exciting to look at today, because there's a lot of hope within that practice.
That's such a wonderful way of putting it. That figure, again, on the right, particularly reminded me of the very large African masks that are so big that they have shoulder harnesses. Mm-hmm. And so the wearer puts them on the shoulders because they're so heavy and so enormous. And the thing about that too is that it is an assumption. It is a decision to wear, not just a burden. Mm-hmm. So we are going to move to our very last images, which are the Restless Earth. These are works that Lam collaborated with Edouard Glissant. And I know that Beverly has a reading for us, but before we move to questions in the reading, I just wanted to see, are there things that you'd like to tell us about this collaboration?
Well, I think it's one of many collaboration we have in the show. We really wanted to bring into the show Lam's attention, love for language and poetry, and the way he was able to collaborate meaningfully with the great writers and poets of his time, from Aimé Césaire, André Breton, René Char, and of course Glissant. And here there's those kind of two extraordinary figure in the 20th century that meet really side by side with this extraordinary text by Glissant, La Terre Inquiète, and to really make it personal, we are showing the manuscript from that text, so handwritten by Glissant, and those figures that comes, with that volume. So that kind of complicity he had with some of the great thinker of his time is not only expressed in his illustration, but also in the title of his works. The title of the show, When I Don't Sleep, I Dream, come indirectly from LUR and poetry. So that idea that he's an artist, and that's very singular, that he would trust so much his friend writers and poets that he would let them title his work, creating almost another work, another layer on top of his own work. So that's a little bit our aim here, is to also show that a position that he had working on a very small, intimate scale and at a huge scale, like the large composition. But maybe, Beverly, you want to add a few things specifically on Glissant?
No, I mean, I'll read at the end of the questions a text that Glissant wrote in 1983 about Lam after his death, the year after his death. But it is remarkable, just what Christophe is saying, how important poetry was to Lam and how important this interaction with poets was to him. It was really central to his thinking, and he really thought that poetry was the most important of the arts, that it had the most transformative power, the most, to change the world. But he was a painter, so he did his best, and he did his part. But it's also important to note that Lam was important and key for these poets. For Glissant, Lam really showed the way in terms of visual arts for some of the things that he was thinking about and working on. The same is true for Césaire. So we found out during the course of our research, for example, that Frantz Fanon, in one of his plays, had a Lam painting as part of the stage direction. So, it included a painting by Lam. Lam was really an important figure for all of these poets and thinkers and people who wanted to change the world in the post-war period.
Well, thank you both so much. This has been just an extraordinary opportunity for me to discuss this wonderful exhibition with you. And for our participants, if you're in the New York area, why haven't you gone to see this show yet? Or why haven't you gone for your fourth time? So I'll turn it back over to Chloe. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for this conversation. I have to echo Amanda. That was fantastic and such a pleasure to listen to. We have a few questions, and if you're an audience member and you would like to ask a question, please post it at the link in the chat. I would love to give you a chance to ask, and I do encourage folks to ask your questions yourselves. It's always nice to hear from you. The first question, Christophe and Beverly, is wondering if you can share a bit more about the main challenges or surprises that you encountered in the process of organizing this exhibition.
You want me to start, Beverly?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think the challenge was to, Lam's work, Lam is a very well-known figure in the 20th century. However, his work is very much scattered around the world. So what we really wanted to do is just go back to the drawing board, just to see as many things as we could, really disseminated around the planet, and just to come out with our own selection, try to reset a little bit our understanding of Lam. And knowing that so many of those works are very large scale, extremely fragile, needed to be reframed, conserved, often reglazed. Work on paper need to have some kind of glazing around it, but it can be very reflective. So how can we show work on paper as well as a painting with this kind of same wall power that a painting can have? So that was some of the challenge we encounter, very logistical challenge, but also sometimes that the scholarship needed to be developed. Like we didn't really know whose Lam father was. We still hardly know it. We didn't really know who his mother was. We found out that she was the first woman in a family to be born as a free woman. And that suddenly connects those dots between the jungle itself and, of course, that radical statement against slavery and his own background, his own life. And here we had, for instance, to hire a genealogist to look into archive in Cuba and Mexico and somewhere to find those, to piece those information together. But at the same time, it's been one of the most exciting projects, at least have been involved with.
Yeah, I would just echo Christophe's words that because the work is scattered around the world, because the scholarship is also scattered around the world, there are texts in Italian and French and Spanish and English. And it was great to have a partner who could handle the French, and I took care of the
As for the
Spanish.
Spanish,
And we did our best with the Italian, but the scholarship and the artwork and everything is transnational, like the artist. So we had to be as ambitious as Lam's life and his project in order to really, be able to see as much as we could and try to present a coherent and new selection. Like, we're so proud that we were able to show so many works that have never been exhibited in the United States before.
Thank you both so much for those answers, and thank you for that question. The next question is from me. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about the importance of music to Lam. I read in a piece written by his son that music was always going in his studio, and I'm curious about how that, or if that impacted the work in your minds.
We know a little bit about it. We know that he was actually quite interested in classical music, not so much popular music, and that he supported the symphony in Havana. But we couldn't figure out is how exactly to think about it in terms of what we were looking at, like that jump, from what inspires an artist to how it is manifest on the surface of a work. I at least had a difficulty, though some things look very syncopated and some things have, this interesting motion and movement in the works. But it's not surprising he was incredibly literate and interested in poetry and in music with that same kind of fanatical devotion to innovation and creation that he was in the fine arts. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Christophe.
No, I mean, that's just like like poetry, like language, he was clearly fascinated by music, but he wasn't a musician himself. He wasn't even a dancer. So the idea of rhythm, the idea of how you engage the body would be like, and most probably his mode of expression was painting. And through that, you do find echoes of modes of expression that fascinated him, but that also he couldn't fulfill himself.
Thank you for those answers. Pierre in the audience has asked if you can speak a little bit more about opacity. You had talked about Glissant's concept of opacity and sort of how it works its way into the painting. Pierre asks, how is the concept of opacity that was discussed thought of, considering that Lam is unclothed in his self-portrait and in a sense more exposed there? Yes, how do you think this relates across his paintings overall?
I think there's maybe multiple answers to that at different moments of his life. So that might apply at certain moments and less at other moments. But I think there is also something in Lam that at least always fascinates me, that capacity to to be always very open to multiple interpretation, that you cannot really explain, that you cannot even describing a work by Lam, just bringing, let's say, clarity or transparency, as we did just today, is very difficult. Every time I find myself talking about the jungle, I say very different things. You know, the work escapes sometimes language or capacity to rationalize what we are looking at. So that's maybe one of the threads that would characterize Lam. But maybe Beverly has other thoughts.
No, I think that's on the right track. I mean, what is remarkable about his work is his commitment is very strong, but it's not didactic, and he's never explains anything. Like the most clear message that we get in any of his paintings is perhaps the Civil War, because it was commissioned and it had to be about the Civil War, and it's very direct. But otherwise, they're so multi-layered and live in this space that is completely his, that is imagined, you know, sprung from his brain and his experience, that he never tries to be didactic or over prescriptive about anything or explain anything in deep. So instead, we have atmospheres, we have reactions, we have places where we feel like we're connected or we're rebuffed, you know, and that's part of the experience of the work, is that it isn't an easy read.
Thank you both for those answers, and thank you for that question, Pierre. We have time for one more question, and I am going to pass the microphone to Fong at the rail to ask.
Thank you so much, Christophe. Thank you, Beverly. Congratulations on a wonderful show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I've been seeing it already twice. I'm coming back this Friday. Thank you, Amanda. I just have two questions tied up into one. One is rather historical, and the other one is more archival related question. The first one was, one of the early privilege when I was so young was to spend a weekend with Marta in Tarquinia in the July 1986 on a traveling grant. And I was sent to meet him through my Shapiro and my professor, Nicholas Caron, who had a wonderful studio in Via Margutta, where Fontana and, you know, people like Facino and had their studio. Nick had the studio there, where he allowed Marta to stay after his flee in New York, particularly after the Gorky suicide in July 21st, 1948, I believe. So it was so interesting. So when I spent the weekend with Marta, I did ask him about Wifredo Lam and also the relationship to Gorky. And he essentially told me they met not in Paris, but in New York in 1945, I believe. That's when he claimed to, which is so interesting to me, because whatever the complexity of the two relationships have met, it's also somewhat entangled with Gorky too. So my question is that in addition to their practice exploring psychic automatism, whatever meant for Lam to go back and regain historical memory of Afro-Cuban culture, Marta is going to inward into his own, well-known, as we know, inscape. So my question, how much is it that we know when their relationship had gained? Is there any letter correspondence between them, Beverly, particularly?
You know, Lam does meet Mata in New York in the late 40s, like 46 maybe.
46, okay.
Yeah. And also there was that magazine Instead.
Yes.
And Lam contributed some drawings to that magazine, which Mata and Lionel, remind me this man's name. I'm forgetting. Pardon?
Lionel Trillian?
I forget the name. I'm sorry. But there was a magazine called Instead that was a sort of surrealist-like magazine that it published important texts. And Mata was involved, and they invited Lam to contribute drawings. Lam was part of many of the surrealist exhibitions that were happening in New York in the 40s, even if he wasn't able to visit until later. And then, of course, they knew each other in Europe afterwards. But it doesn't start, their relationship doesn't start really till the late 1940s.
Yeah.
But there's not a lot of correspondence that we found between, but we do know that they were in, many of these overlapping circles of the time.
Yeah, I think you meant Lionel Abel.
That's it, Lionel Abel. That's
yes.
right.
And there was a connection to View magazine, but I don't think it was ever came to fruition. So he may have been asked to illustrate something.
He did the cover of one of the View magazines.
Except the cover, that's right. Yeah. Well, that's good. That's square off my question. The second question is the grand composition is so impressive. I mean, I can't tell you how long I look at that painting. And the mere size and the presence of this momentality is so swift. It's as if it came right out from his head, uncensored. All he had to do was copy the image exactly. It appeared in his imagination. But given that grand scale, we knew that it's clearly articulated in the exhibition because of the condition of poverty, lacking of material access to all the related studio practice that might require. So it's painted on paper. And my question is, how many of them get mounted in the way they did, and when roughly the time? Because the mounting of that side is really complex. And to me, unless you look closely, there's no flaw. When you paint it on paper, on the floor, on the wall, and you mount it on canvas, it's not an easy task. Am I right, Beverly, Christophe?
You're absolutely right. It's a complex operation, but something that can be handled by professional. And Lam would often ask other people to do the mounting. For instance, Grande Composition, he didn't mount it itself. Same thing for the jungle. He did ask the gallery, Pierre Matisse, to have the work mounted for the show. Again, to make it look more like a painting. Before it came to the Museum of Modern Art. And so we know Grande Composition traveled from Cuba rolled, most probably to Brussels with its first owner, and it's most probably there that it was mounted. And it's still very much a challenge today because of the way the paper adheres to the canvas. It becomes very, very fragile. Like for us, for instance, where the work was before we acquired it, we had to roll it again. And that operation, is not a complex one, but it's something you have to handle very, very carefully. But I have to say, Grande Composition is in excellent shape. Because of the large scale, it didn't move that many times. It wasn't rolled so many times. So it went through the decades in very, very good shape.
Yeah. One tiny little question here. The unpainted area, which is the paper, it appeared to be brownish color. Would that mean that oxidation process may have taken place, or the paper already have a slight tint?
So I would say both. It's a craft paper. If you look at the back, for instance, that we are sometimes allowed, not for all the work that are mounted, but you can peek sometime on what's happening in the back of the work. You can see if there is a different there. The craft paper is inherently like a yellowish paper, and that's something most probably was attracted to. Most probably the color changed, slightly over the decades, but most probably not dramatically.
Okay. Wow. Okay. Well, that's good to know. Thank you, Christophe. Thank you, NSE.
Thank you for those questions.
Can't wait to come back. Good to see you this Friday. Thank you, Amanda. Back to you, Chloe.
Thank you, Fong, for that question. We are now going to close out with a reading from Beverly.
Okay. So I'm going to read an excerpt from a essay that Edouard Glissant wrote about Wifredo Lam in 1983. It's called Lam, the Flight and the Meeting. It's been translated for us by Jean Colfa, a scholar who also contributed to the catalog. And it's in our catalog because we have this special section that we called Album, where we collected many, not all, but many works of poetry and statements and works of art that were all dedicated to Wifredo Lam. So this is part of our album section, which we thought was really important to show just how many artists and writers he influenced and touched with his work. So here I go. It feels funny to read someone else's words, but I'm going to do it. It has always seemed to me that Wifredo Lam's art is tied to a double project: to identify and magnify the primordial forms secreted by a very concrete reality, that of his native island, and at the same time, to signal the cultural past that we are experiencing today. For we are pushing through the rough and thick affirmation of so many aesthetics that were still despised yesterday, toward a participation of all in a multiplied, total, unexpected beauty. Lam began by filling the canvas, a poetics not of the tree, but of vegetation, a vertical profusion of what emerges from memory and explodes as a jungle in the island space. This is how he confirms a presence long denied. From the outset, the painter understood that proliferation, this audacity of totality, must be opposed as a counterpoint to the chosen suffocations, to the delights that exhaust themselves. There, at the same time, in the same space as Aimé Césaire, Nicolas Guillen, Langston Hughes, was the delicate thickness of this gallery. The Caribbean people had not just kept the memory of the world, they also carried within them the dazzling line, the ochre eminence of so many recomposed spaces. Lam, high-flying transmuter, has preserved our earthy memories there. But see, he has made it pure delight of an offering where every breeze, wherever it comes from, loves to shudder. There.
That was beautiful, Beverly. Thank you so much for closing us out with that reading. And thank you to you and to Christophe and to Amanda again today for such an amazing and wonderful and thoughtful conversation about this show. I really urge everyone here to go see it. If you're in New York, go see it for the third, fourth, fifth time. And I would like to give a special thank you to Madeline, Olivia, Demacia, and Ava at MoMA for all of their support in preparing for today's event, including providing all of those beautiful images we looked at today. I'd like to thank Tiger Foundation for sponsoring the New Social Environment program and making conversations like this one possible. They also support our archive, where you'll be able to view this soon on YouTube. The Rail has been free and independent for 25 years. A donation directly supports us, our writers, our staff, and our operations. You can support our work at the link in the chat. And if you're free tomorrow at 1 p.m., do join us for a conversation with Glenn Adamson, Severin Delphs, and Jessica Holmes on the occasion of the exhibition Drop Cloth, which is on at Susan Inglet Gallery and Hollis Taggart. And as is Rail tradition, you can now turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so
This
much.
is
What a
great.
Thank
fantastic
you.
conversation.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Beverly.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Amanda. Thank you,
Thank you,
Christophe.
Beverly. This is
Wonderful.
amazing.
This
Fabulous.
discussion of an
Thank you,
incredible,
Beverly.
incredible
Thank
show.
you.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you, Fong.
Thank you,
so
Beverly.
much.
Thank you, Christophe. Go see the show, everyone.
Yay. Yes.
Bye,
Bye.
You
everybody.
too.
Take care.